Hello, everybody. I'm Mita Spiotti. I work as an acquisitions editor for literary and cultural studies at De Gruyter. I'm here today representing the De Gruyter Foundation, a not-for-profit organization whose aim is to support exceptional research and scholarship in the humanities. Thank you for joining today's 6th live episode of Humanities for Humans, which we organized together with our partner 1014. For those of you joining for the first time, with this series of conversations, we bring urgent public debates under the scrutiny of top humanities scholars from both sides of the Atlantic, who help put them into context and bring much needed nuance and complexity to them.
And I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014. You might wonder what 1014 stands for. It's also a not-for-profit organization, and it's named after our physical event space on Fifth Avenue in New York. At 1014, we bring people together from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss pressing global topics. Today's transatlantic conversation, World on the Move, is certainly one of these very important topics. The numbers of people on the move might just throw us into despair, but I hope that at the end of this discussion, we'll change our view a little bit on that and end on a more optimistic note with views and thoughts from our two experts who are joining us today. First of all, I would like to wholeheartedly thank Irene Terkessidis, Professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature at Dartmouth, who's not only moderating today's discussion, but she's also curating the entire series, Humanities for Humans. Irene is also a series editor at De Gruyter and a 1014 board member. And of course, I would like to thank today's speakers, Professor Kathryn Abrams and Dr. Mark Terkessidis. Thank you so much for offering your time and expertise. And Irene, with that, over to you.
So I want to say hello, good evening to those of you on the other side of the Atlantic from where I am in New York, and good day to those of you on the East Coast in the area, and good morning to all of you in California who got up early for this, as did one of our speakers. I want to welcome you to Humanities for Humans. As Dr. Aspiotti said, if you're here for the first time, we eagerly greet your interest in understanding more about how humanities scholars think and what are the questions that we concern ourselves with. I have one housekeeping issue, which is if you would like to ask a question of our speakers, you can put that into the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, and I'll get to as many questions as I can. All right. So with that, I would love to introduce today's speakers. Professor Kathryn Abrams of the Law School at the University of California at Berkeley is an expert in feminist legal theory and in storytelling. These areas led her to her current interest in social movements that aim to influence the law, and to a recent book publication called Open Hand, Closed Fist, Practices of Undocumented Organizing in a Hostile State. We have a reading list that is posted on the registration page for this and will continue to be posted, so you can find that book and works by Dr. Terkessidis and other authors on our topics. Professor Abrams is passionate about bringing to the surface, that is, bringing into public view, human agency, individual or collective, human agency that persists even in circumstances of enormous constraint. On a more personal note, I want to signal that Professor Abrams and I are into our 5th decade of friendship, and I have learned so much from her about politics, about the profession, and about personal issues. So thank you very much, Kathy, for being here today. Dr. Mark Terkessidis joins us today from Berlin, Germany, where he is an independent scholar who has contributed profoundly to conversations in writing and orally on vital topics including racism, post-colonialism, multicultural societies, and of course, migration. Author of dozens of books and articles, Dr. Terkessidis is well known to readers and listeners of many major German newspapers and radio stations. I myself first got to know him through brilliant interviews he has given to the Süddeutsche Zeitung, the newspaper of Munich, which I consider the New York Times of Germany. I was delighted when he agreed to participate in this conversation, and I got to meet him in person. Mark, thank you so very much for becoming a part of Humanities for Humans. So I'd like to give us now just a very brief introduction to the topic, and then I'm going to turn it over to the experts. As I speak these words, more individuals have been forcibly displaced from their homes than at any other time since records of refugeedom began to be kept. In 2023, that's more than 110 million people, according to the United Nations. Persecution, human rights violations, environmental degradation, and of course, armed conflicts, small and large, have turned mostly would-be homebodies into not would-be refugees. The most recent eruption of violence in the Middle East has internally displaced 1.8 million Gazans, approximately 80% of the entire population. We should also think of the almost 5 million people displaced this year alone by the conflict in the Sudan, and the 5 million Ukrainians who left their country, along with 7 million Ukrainians who are believed by the United Nations to have been internally displaced since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. In the spirit of the humanities, however, I have asked our experts to focus not so much on the quantitative, though they're welcome to bring that up when it seems relevant, but rather to help us folks who are not experts to understand frameworks for thinking about displaced individuals, whether we are calling them refugees, asylum seekers, or would-be immigrants. So with that, Dr. Abrams and Dr. Terkessidis, I want to throw out a few questions. You can use my framing, or as I just suggested, reject my framing and offer a different one. What should we citizens of what are sometimes referred to as receiving countries be thinking of as the source of our obligation to people on the move? Or perhaps to myself reframe my own question, if you could snap your fingers and transform current discussions in the public sphere about migration, what would you change? How would you wish these related topics to be framed differently? Dr. Abrams, do you mind starting us off?
Happy to start us off, and I'm delighted to be here with both of you. If I could snap my fingers, I would propose a very different way of thinking about migration. We in the West or in the global North are accustomed to thinking about our citizenship in wealthy countries and correlatively our ability to deny entry to others as a kind of natural endowment. This concept stems, I think, from the notion of the sovereign state as having territorial control over its borders and as having the ability to determine who lives within those borders and who doesn't. But if we ask what puts citizens in the United States or in other wealthier countries in the position to be making these decisions about the material conditions under which so many people wind up living, the answer is, I think, what my colleague Ayelet Shachar, in a book by this name, has brilliantly called the birthright lottery. Prospects for your survival and every aspect of your mental and physical well-being, that of your children, that of their children, depend almost exclusively on the accident of where you were born and who your parents were. And to make matters worse, this lottery outcome is then passed from generation to generation, like the most regressive kind of inherited property. So if we look at the question of membership in wealthier, more privileged countries, not through the eyes of the sovereign state's right to exclude, but through the eyes of this random, inequitable, undeserved lottery that's passed through generations, we might be inclined to approach migration differently. Now, Shachar has had two ideas about how we would approach things differently, one more novel and one which is joined by a variety of migration scholars, including myself. The novel idea is that we might think about taxing the intergenerational transmission of citizenship property in the wealthy countries, the same way that we tax inheritances that we also don't want to privilege. You could use the proceeds to fund infrastructure programs and other kinds of programs that provide for life necessities in countries where the inherited benefits of citizenship are a lot more meager. Now, I might amend this by saying that since we're unlikely to be able to fund change in sending countries soon enough to be able to stem the tide of migration, Shahar's is a very utopian kind of solution, it seems only fair that we in wealthier countries should be willing to face challenges, endure change, inconvenience, diminution of our comfort, to compensate for the windfall of having enjoyed this immeasurable, totally unearned advantage. A second idea is that instead of this notion of blood, that is who your parents are, or soil, where you were born, and its intergenerational transmission being the basis for establishing citizenship, we think about creating new bases for recognizing membership. One that many scholars have suggested has to do with connection, the extent to which you, as a new member of society, participate in reciprocal exchange with your new country through the economy, through the political system, through civil society. Now, I should say this lens is not likely to be adopted overnight, but it points to the need that I feel, and I think many feel today, confronting the tired and sort of recursive ways we tend to talk about migration, to displace ways of thinking about migration that are causing us to fortify our borders and our psyches unnecessarily, and I think inevitably unsuccessfully.
That is so very helpful and a great way to start off. Dr. Terkessidis, you can respond to some of that, or just give us your own framing right away, and then we'll go into back and forth.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation too. I would support a lot of points that Kathryn always raised, but we can talk about that later. Actually, I would like to talk about the numbers first, although we were like going off somewhere else, because there's always that number that that you have a record of people on the move. And we have a record of people on Earth right now. So if you put it in absolute numbers, it sounds so much, but nevertheless, there have been conflicts all along the way. And if we talk about 110 million refugees right now, that is the number the UNHCR provides us with. We have to say that most of these refugees are not coming to the West, but most of these refugees are fleeing in neighboring countries. And this is quite decisive, because if we raise that number in Europe, for example, 110 million refugees, there's this picture that they are all waiting at the border to come to Europe. And that is actually not true. Most of the people who came as refugees to Europe in the last 10 years came from neighboring countries, from Syria and from Ukraine. Syria is a neighboring country of the European Union. And if we talk about migrants, I have my problem with this notion too. Or if we talk about immigrants, I have this problem also. I mean, I'm here in Berlin, Kreuzberg, and if I go outside, there are so many expats living here. And these expats are actually expecting you to speak English with them, because they are wealthy and they are often arrogant, and they think they have the right to be in Germany and expect other people to speak their language. And then you have like people who are living in a central accommodation, coming from Syria or other places, war-torn places, or central placement actually in Berlin. And there is such a huge difference between those two groups of people that it doesn't make sense to speak of immigrants. They are expats and they're refugees. And even if you talk about refugees, there's a huge difference if you are a refugee from Syria or if you are a refugee from Ukraine, because for the Ukrainians, the federal government in Germany, but also all along Europe, they all decided that the Ukrainians have the right to work immediately, while other refugees have to stay away from the labor market for 1 year, often live in central placements, and so on and so on. And yeah, that is so we have to differentiate a lot if it comes to immigration. If we look at the numbers right now, because there is a certain hysteria in Europe about people taking refuge in Europe right now, there is literally this picture that the 110 million are at the border. All the countries in Europe are now very much concerned with people fleeing to Europe, and that is our question of immigration actually right now. That so many people come to Europe and we can't stand it anymore. If we look at the numbers for Germany, for example, there are 280,000 applications for asylum right now in the Federal Republic. That is, well, it is not average, but it is not that high actually. But if you look at where the people are coming from, you can see that that 2/3 of those people are coming from 3 destinations: Syria, Turkey, and Afghanistan. So Syria, okay, this is network immigration. You know, people have come from Syria to Germany, and now more people come from Syria to Germany. Same for Turkey. And I mean, if it comes to Afghanistan, this is a country which we actually invaded with our military, and we didn't take the people who helped us with us. We went there to overthrow the government, and then we went away without overthrowing this government and left these people there. It doesn't wonder, it is not, I mean, that these people are coming to Germany, it's not a wonder. Yeah? So these numbers do actually matter, because migration is seen as a problem, is generally seen as a problem. It is reduced to people who are refugees and coming to Europe, and there is not the broad picture, so there is this narrative which we always have to deal with. You know, so we can talk about the solutions, but we have to deal with this narrative, which is actually always about the problems it causes. So, and then my last point, and then I'm done with my first statement. I was never a friend of the idea of open borders. Or I don't think that it is very realistic, because we in Europe, in all the European countries, are very proud of the so-called welfare state. And if you have a welfare state, you can't distribute it to anybody. So you have to define membership to get the resources of the welfare state. So there's always a border. But how do we deal with this border? And I mean, these propositions Kathryn mentioned are actually propositions about how we can democratize the border, how we can make the border a topic of our discourse inside of democracy and not outside of democracy. The border is not a case for the executive. The border is very much the core of the democracy, or the definition of membership is very much the core of democracy. My second point is I kept preaching to politicians in Germany for, I don't know, 20 years, that we need some kind of transparency in Europe for immigration. Yeah, that means like legal immigration, but it means the framework for people who come as refugees to Europe, and we approximately have no transparency. That is a problem of the European Union because migration still is part of the so-called sovereignty of the nation state. So you can like you can make a lot of noise if you are in the government about this topic, but nevertheless there is not enough transparency. There is sometimes no transparency at all about immigration. That is a big problem. That is a very, very big problem for people who were coming to Europe, who want to come to Europe, sometimes who live in Europe.
Okay, great. So this is a fabulous start, and I'm going to use my moderator privilege to just review a few points, because I think both of you have offered us some frameworks that many of us were not thinking about. Kathy, and I'll go to first names since I do have the privilege of knowing you both. This idea of birthright lottery, of privilege, this is something that really comes out of feminist theory, if I could refer to our history of scholarship. The idea that it's important to reflect on what privilege you might enjoy that you really didn't earn by doing something. You just have it because of your gender or the color of your skin, et cetera. And you've used that in terms of birthright. I think that's extremely helpful to us. And Mark, I would say your starting point is really profound. I have been thinking about these issues for a certain amount of time myself, and as a scholar of the catastrophes of the mid-20th century, that's the period that's usually pointed to. And your framing of saying, okay, there's a lot of people on the move, but there are so many more people on Earth. I have never heard anyone say that before. And again, I've been thinking about these topics a lot. So that alone is extremely helpful, because I immediately in my head thought, are the 40 to 60 million on the move at the end of World War II actually more than the 110 million right now, if you compare it to the size of the world population? So I just want to point that out to everybody, that even though we're talking numbers, it's the ability to create a framework for those numbers that can be very helpful to us moving the discussion forward. And this is, I hope, not too personal, but I would just say the idea about the expats, that it's actually a lot of wealthy people who have moved. This is the case of Switzerland. If you ask what the largest group of quote unquote immigrants or migrants in Switzerland, it's actually Germans who have come to Switzerland to earn better salaries. That's the biggest group. It's not the Africans who have come, or those from the Middle East or from the Syrian conflict. So that's very powerful. And I just want to bring home one other point, which is in terms of Palestinian refugees, in terms of Sudanese refugees, your point about neighboring countries is absolutely spot on. The biggest number of Palestinians, to my knowledge, is still in Lebanon and Jordan, right? And now Turkey has taken, in terms of Syrian refugees, they have taken a huge number, and they are the neighboring country. In the Sudan, they have fled to all countries around the border of the Sudan. So I think this is another very helpful kind of framing. Now, you've also raised the issue of what narratives are we telling? And Kathy, I would just invite you to pick up on that issue of the narratives we tell about migration, or if you want to pick up on a different point. But I, again, want our audience to realize we've already had some very, very helpful framings to think about these migration issues, not just as a problem, but what is the perceived problem? I think that's what your framings have pointed out to us. Thank you so much for that alone. But let's keep going. We've got some more time. Kathy, do you want to respond to some things that Mark said?
Sure. Yeah, I think that many of the things that Mark points to are patterns that we see in the United States too. The idea that there is just an unprecedented number of people amassed at our border that is creating some sort of an emergency is sort of a narrative of threat is something that I want to talk about because I think it's been very important. Beyond that, the fact that, sometimes in the US, the debate goes under the name, we are here because you were there, meaning that immigrants are coming to the United States because of things that the United States very purposefully did in their countries that created the kind of disruption and the kind of persecution that makes people want to flee. We saw the death last week of Henry Kissinger. To take one example of somebody whose geopolitics had a huge effect in disrupting sort of emergent democratic orders in Argentina or in Chile. So America acts as if T1 was when people presented themselves at the border, when in fact T1 was when we intervened in many ways, from supporting juntas to NAFTA, which has had huge effects on Mexican agriculture. And so I think that is really worth underscoring on both sides of the Atlantic. So in terms of narratives, I think that in the US, almost everyone across the political spectrum is currently participating in this narrative of threat. And it has received its most robust articulation from people like Donald Trump, who literally talk about, most recently, vermin poisoning the blood of true Americans. But I've also been surprised to hear similar, though perhaps less explicitly racist or xenophobic narratives of threat coming from some surprising quarters. New York City's mayor, Eric Adams, who says that the 10,000 asylum seekers entering the city every month are going to, quote, destroy New York. Or even the federal government's talk about a border crisis, where the crisis is simply the number of people coming and not the unwillingness of the federal government to offer any kind of adequate response to changing conditions of migration or the humanitarian disaster that has resulted. Those are two crises right there. But the crisis is always the number of people that's approaching. I think that this narrative, at least in the United States, and I'll be interested to hear whether Mark thinks that there are resonances of in Europe, has served people across the spectrum in different ways because migration has kind of become a third rail of American politics. And I say because there are lots of third rails of American politics these days, but migration is surely one of them. It's become the lightning rod issue for a kind of white nationalism that's been aroused by a variety of other factors, from changes in the economy that make it impossible to rely on jobs that provide a family wage for decades over time. It has arisen from demographic transitions in the United States that are soon going to make us what we already are in California, which is a majority ethnic and racial minority population, and what that means for the electoral system. But with Trump's leadership, although it certainly predates him, migration is an important way that the desire to return to some mythical homogeneous past gets articulated in politics. But concerns about migration do extend beyond this group because of the way we think about citizenship as entailing a right to exclude, because of the way that the issue has been completely mismanaged at the border, even as the numbers approaching have recently increased. Uncertainty about whether a concern about migration is going to make a larger group of voters amenable to this white nationalistic vision of Trump, and the unprecedented danger that we perceive his election as posing in the US has made Democrats and the Biden administration really reluctant to stake out affirmative ground on migration. And they collaborate in a rhetoric of threat. that's tempered only by a kind of feeble humanitarianism. And I say feeble because Democrats in the current administration have reinstituted a lot of the worst policies of the Trump administration, like having to seek asylum in third-party countries before you present yourself at the US border. So my sense is that this equivocation has not worked for progressives in this country, and that those who support welcoming more people on the move need to think differently about how to talk about migrants and how to talk about the process of migration. And I think there needs to be more explicit conversation, not just about the challenges, say, of providing housing or of authorizing asylum seekers to work, but about the kinds of opportunities and benefits that could come from welcoming even large numbers of members to our communities. And I think this involves a change in the way we talk about immigrants and their agency. The idea of constantly depicting huge numbers of people amassed at the borders collaborates in a kind of Emma Lazarus notion of migration. The tired, the poor, the huddled masses, the wretched refuse. I mean, this completely glorifies our beneficence and understates both the humanity and the agency of people who are coming. So I think it's important that we understand the extraordinarily difficult position that the conditions of their home countries, sometimes brought about by US intervention, and our laws, which are part of what keeps people amassed at the border and the conditions in which we find them. These have put people in a very bad situation, but we should also understand that this is not the sum total of what they are or are capable of. And we need to give a better account of the contributions that immigrants are capable of making in the communities in which they come to live. I can stop there, or I can talk about—
I was going to say, I've seen Mark shaking his
jump in
agreement quite a bit. So let's not lose agency, because you have done some very important work on that. But Mark, I know you have some reactions to what Kathy just said. So why don't you jump in on that?
It's quite interesting how similar the situation in Europe and the United States is. It never was that similar, to be true. I mean, there has been some kind of convergence maybe if it comes to immigration, but nevertheless, if it comes to incompetent politicians or incompetent government. I'm sorry to say that, but it is really a problem of incompetent government, because they are thinking so short-term that they are actually not able to have a grip on the bigger picture. I mean, we talked about, in 2015, we talked about the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. That was the people from Syria coming in large numbers. And I mean, actually, it was not a refugee crisis, it was a crisis of government, because the war in Syria was raging for years. The Lebanese, the Turks, the Greeks, they were all complaining. The people in Jordan, they were all complaining that they couldn't take any more refugees from Syria. UNHCR went through Europe for years, telling them that they only have 40% of the resources to deal with the refugees. They needed 60% more, and they didn't give them any money. So, I mean, that was foreseeable. Every expert has told them, okay, this is coming. Sometimes you're waiting for people to come to Europe, and then they start walking, actually. And then it is a refugee crisis. And it is actually a crisis of government. It is not a refugee crisis. So I mean, there are so many things I can immediately relate to. Right now, we have the problem that while the people were from Syria and the Ukraine were coming to Europe, in most countries, the federal governments coordinated the process of distributing the people to the municipalities and supported the municipalities with money to help the people find a place to live and eat and so on, yeah? And maybe be integrated into the labor market. And now they are not doing it anymore, and they are actually more or less creating the crisis. They are pretending to fight them. So you have the Chancellor of Germany, Europe's biggest state, on the cover of Der Spiegel, which is a quite important, not so important anymore, but a quite important weekly in Germany, and she's like she's looking very decisive, and he's telling we have to expel more people from Germany. And he knows that it is not possible to do that because they are protected by the fact that you can't expel people to countries where they are prosecuted, where they are where they're going into a war or something like this. Yeah? So he can't do, but he tells it to you. So you have always this difference between between a theater of sovereignty and the lack of sovereignty. And actually, that applies to the right-wing people, even the mobs, to join in. They are doing the resistance work. They are doing these white power groups. They are actually doing the resistance work for the government in this kind of crisis, and that is quite perverse. I think that is quite perverse policy to do that. But nevertheless, what Kathryn said is that there is the populist, right-wing populist fraction who wants to return to a mythical place where we all were family. But it doesn't explain this whole fear or around Europe, around the US also. And I mean, people had to deal with like the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. Then there was 3 years of pandemic. Then there was the invasion of Ukraine, which is nearer to us than to you. And then there was inflation. And inflation is a huge problem. For lower middle class people, a huge problem for a lower middle class. We don't talk about this enough, especially in Germany, where the wages are not so high compared to Switzerland or other places. So if the prices for butter are raised or oil or so on, that is creating a huge problem for a lot of people. And so they have the idea that they should be helped first and not the other people. And that is an idea which seems very logical. Although we need a lot of immigration because the German labor market, as labor markets in other European countries, actually is craving for people right now. A huge problem for German economy that they can't fill they don't have enough workforce.
Right. So we've got some comments coming in from the audience, and just basically with more examples, thinking about differential treatment of Cubans versus Haitian refugees to the United States. Also wondering, did we not learn anything from the fall of Saigon that could have elucidated the plight of Afghanis who were seeking to escape? This gets back to something Mark was saying about the Afghani collaborators in the sense of helpers, translators, etc., who got left behind when the Western powers just pulled out. I don't know if either of you wants to comment on one of those examples, or if we're moving forward with this idea of narratives and agency, right? Kathy, I don't know if this is the right moment, but it's so short anyway. Can you tell us a little bit? You talked to people who were undocumented but had plenty of agency. What happened there? Just a brief peek into your book, for example.
Sure. So we have been talking about people who are on the move because of persecution or war in their home countries. And there is a whole different category of immigrants or migrants or people on the move that is probably the dominant group in the United States, which is people who have come here for a variety of reasons, some of them economic, some of them forms of violence and threat in their home countries that just don't come under the legal definitions of refugee or asylum. But they have either come to the United States on visas and overstayed, or they've passed over the border without inspection. And so they're living in the United States without any form of legal status, without documents. And in the United States right now, estimates are something like 11 to 12 million people in this category. And during the early 2000s and 2010s, there was a spate of state immigration legislation that was designed to make things so miserable for people who were living in the US without status that they would so-called self-deport and return to their home countries. And one of the states that first started this pattern was the state of Arizona, which legislated in many ways to increase the surveillance over people living without status, to deny them all kinds of whatever meager set of rights and welfare entitlements they had in the United States were completely denied. And one of the things that was very surprising is that a movement of undocumented people formed in some of the most hostile areas of the country to advocate for their rights and to try to turn the tide of politics in the places that they were living. And this is really contrary to what you would expect, because usually social movements are movements of citizens who can make a claim, a legal claim on the government, that mobilize when political circumstances offer them an opening. And this was just the opposite. And so what I did was to spend several years observing and interviewing the emergence and flourishing of this movement and try to figure out how these immigrants basically authorized themselves and each other to become participants in the political system and to become claims makers in quite an effective way. And one of the most interesting ways that I observed, in my book, I call it performative citizenship, but it is people without status taking on roles very familiar to the public because they're usually played by citizens. And a good example is registering voters. I mean, the League of Women Voters in the United States, citizens register voters. But people who were undocumented became very active in registering voters and explaining to Latino citizens who might be reluctant political participants what the stakes of voting were. And this turned out to create very substantial changes in the Latino electorate in the state of Arizona. In the city of Phoenix, it got rid of an anti-immigrant sheriff. It created a half Latino city council. But it also played a big role in turning the state purple, as we saw in the elections of 2020 and 2022. So there are other ways that people participated as entrepreneurs, as people who set up churches and community groups and sort of breathed a kind of civic life into communities. And so one of the things I walked away from that research with, walked away is too decisive. I still follow the people there and I'm very interested in their efforts. But one of the things that I drew from it is that there is all kinds of resourcefulness and agency exercised by people who lack legal status, lack economic means, often lack basic forms of acceptance in states, that could be put to extraordinary purpose in this country. This is a time to think about political participation where native-born Americans are so profoundly cynical and disillusioned with our political system. The idea of people who know that they cannot vote, that are willing to invest in the political participation of others, is a kind of energy that I think would really benefit the country.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to refer again people to Dr. Abrams' book, Open Hand, Closed Fist, so that you could get more of the details. But Mark, we're gonna have to end soon with our last round of back and forth. But before we do that, I was just wondering, is there an example of something that Germany or another country anywhere in the world has done right in terms of policy that we could maybe just tell other people about, maybe tell our own politicians about? I'm wondering, what have you seen that felt like it did contribute positively to a new narrative or a reframing of what's going on? I know there's a lot to be negative about. You've mentioned Giorgia Meloni and looking to Albania for solutions. We have the recent elections in the Netherlands. Are there any positive things that we can take from what's going on in Europe right now?
Yeah, well, until recently, the German development was extremely positive. I mean, we came from a citizenship law which was exclusively based on blood, which stems from the year 1913, and actually, I mean, the most extreme version of it was the Nuremberg laws from 1935. And it survived these the Nazi time and was only changed in 2000, but then quite profoundly changed. So Germany, from a society which was completely exclusive, went in 20 years to I don't know, what would you call it, a diverse, very, very diverse society. I mean, now in German cities, if you look at the bigger cities in the west of Germany, it's not only the bigger cities, it's the smaller cities too, actually. If you look at the children under 6 years, there's actually a majority of kids who have the so-called immigration background. So at least one parent has him or herself migrated to Germany. So this is a huge demographic change, and even if the right-wing populists are a strong fraction in Germany, if you look at the positive things happening in Germany, this kind of liberal development is a kind of example. Even now there is discussion to change the citizenship law again to liberalize it even more. So I think all these developments towards inclusion are positive. So if you look at the state polities in different countries of Europe, you can always see that there are positive developments and there are negative developments at the same time. It is really not only a negative development. I mean, I'm really afraid of that Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and his party have become the strongest fraction in the parliament, in the Dutch parliament, because he's really an extremist. He's really the I mean, I don't know, there is no difference between his program and the program of his intellectual mind Martin Bosma and what and the manifest of Anders Breivik, who shot 90 people in Norway. Actually, that is quite dangerous. But nevertheless, there are 75% of voters in the Netherlands who are actually very much opposed to this party, and I mean, if you look at the lawmaking in the Netherlands, there are many positive examples for how it developed into inclusive society. So you have always both. That is reaction and counter reaction, and that makes the situation so complicated.
Absolutely. And I just want to say we have some very good comments in the chat, and I hope the audience is reading each other's comments, because unfortunately we don't have time to read them all. I'm going to invite each of you to take 2 minutes to perhaps make a point again or give us another example before we have to close. There are so many issues we haven't been able to touch on, but I think we've been able to offer to the audience some very helpful questions to ask. I've already asked, but I'll repeat because it's so important. Is there something that ordinary citizens could be doing right now to change the narrative? One of our audience members thinks of the 19th century mass migration from Europe into the United States. Is that a time that we should be thinking about? Can it help us change the narrative of what's going on? Which of you would like to go first? You each have about 2-3 minutes to give us one more point before, unfortunately, we have to close down. Kathy, you wanna
Okay. So I always hesitate to use the term broken immigration system in talking about what we have, because I think in many ways the immigration system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, at least in the United States. That is to protect our random inherited birth windfall and to keep those migrants who are admitted, often to satisfy the needs of businesses who need labor, as precarious and vulnerable as possible so as not to cause problems. So while we may not have a broken immigration system, we certainly have, at the moment in the United States, a broken political system. And I think that is likely to prevent us from the obfuscation at the executive level, to the paralysis at the congressional level, to the God knows what at the judicial level, is going to keep us from making the kinds of changes in immigration law and policy that I think we need in the at least the short-term future. But in terms of thinking about what we can do as citizens, I sometimes think that these times when immediate change isn't possible can be very rich times for generating new kinds of ideas. One of the things that I saw in the movement that I observed was during the Trump administration, when national change was certainly not possible in a pro-immigrant direction. Organizations used the time to make local change, or they used the time to engage in self-reflection on how they were organizing for politics, what it was costing their members, and how they might do it better. And I think similarly, we can make use of this possibly extended lacuna. First, to intervene at the level of ideas and discourse. We need new ways, like the birthright lottery, of conceiving what we in affluent countries owe to those who are on the move. And again, I think the local level provides us opportunities to produce more change in places that are receptive to it. This is where immigrant agencies had its greatest purchase, and this is where we, as those who are lucky enough to enjoy citizenship, can collaborate in solidarity with migrants as the chance arises. I might want to close with an example of a wonderful organization that I and my students work with. It's a group called Freedom for Immigrants, and it is an organization that works toward the abolition of the detention of immigrants. Is abolition of immigrant detention something that's likely to emerge in the short-term future? Absolutely not. We are detaining and incarcerating more immigrants as time goes by. But has this group had some amazing successes by working in solidarity with those detained? Yes, because it works not only to seek abolition on a national scale, but to liberate as many of those currently in detention as possible by supporting them financially in seeking bail, or by appearing en masse in immigration court hearings to show that people who are seeking release on bail have community support, or by participating in so-called accompaniment programs that are a little bit like sponsorship, but they're not advanced by the federal government, and they don't require that civilians enforce the responsibility of migrants to show up at hearings or to leave the country if they're ordered. They simply mean driving, providing places of shelter, providing connections within the community, easing the transition from a situation of detention to a situation of community participation. This kind of accompaniment permits us, me, my students, to learn about people who are often the most stigmatized, to see the resourcefulness and tenacity they have, even under very difficult circumstances, and to collaborate with them in improving their circumstances to the degree currently possible.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful in the concreteness of it as well. We also had a comment in the chat about accompanying people in their legal interactions, their interactions with the legal system. I know of situations in Nebraska where just ordinary people were trying to give English lessons and learn Spanish to work with the Mexican meat workers who had been brought into Nebraska. So, and we know about the outrage about separation of children from their parents at the southern border. So there are things that are being done, and I love your idea about the local. And Mark, you had mentioned so much about the municipalities, that a lot was going right at the local level, and it was really when support from the government started to fall apart, when the rhetoric started to change, when there stopped being coordination, that beautiful integration of Syrian refugees, they had real housing, right? They were able to be brought out of these larger centers and put in real housing that could afford some dignity. Mark, you also have 2 minutes. Please, just, it's so much I know you can share, but what's most on your mind?
You know, if it comes to accompanying immigrants to their interactions with the legal system, that was actually a mass phenomenon in Germany. After 2015, that was a mass phenomenon. There was so much involvement with helping the refugees, and more and more it came to dealing with the legal system, actually. But after years, still 50% of the people who initially helped were still supporting the refugees. So that is actually a mass phenomenon. In everyday life, it is much better than you see it in the media, who actually do what Barry Glasner has called in the 90s culture of fear. They're actually in the business of emotionalizing, polarizing, and creating problems. You know, on an everyday level, there is this public involvement of people in big numbers. And if it comes to the municipalities, I don't know if it is a beautiful integration, but nevertheless, the municipalities actually managed to pull big waves of immigration out of central placement and into regular housing or apartments. And that is a precondition for living together, actually, that you're not in a central placement. That is very, very important for inclusion. And yeah, so there's many positive things you can speak about, and the citizens of Europe they are not ignorant about people who need help, but maybe sometimes they're a little bit ignorant about rights and about how citizenship is constructed, and about the border has to be democratized, and so on. And there is a lack of political agency in that, even from the people who have an immigrant background themselves or are engaged in these topics.
Right. So I hate to be the timekeeper, but I am. We're pretty much out of time. I want to certainly thank the two of you and our wonderful audience. I would just remind the audience that there are 2 more sessions of Humanities for Humans coming up. One is February 21st with legal scholar Martha Minow from Harvard Law School, and Liz Lerman, who is coming to us truly from the arts. She's a choreographer and a teacher, and they're going to be talking about controversy. How are there better and worse ways to handle controversy? And then on May 6th, in situ at the address 1014 Fifth Avenue, we will have Professor Susanna Heschel from Dartmouth College and Professor Terrence Johnson from Harvard Divinity School talking about organized religion, religious hatred, and the future of secular society. So I hope some of you can join us for that. We're getting lots of thank yous to our speakers in the chat. I want to thank our sponsoring organizations. Thank you so very much, everyone, for being here. This topic is so important to what's going on right now. Please keep reaching out to others to find solutions. And do something concrete when you can. I just mentioned in Berlin, I had the pleasure of participating in something called Sprachcafé, which was a free evening where you just showed up if you wanted to learn better German, or you showed up if you knew German and could help other people learn it. It was a beautiful experience. I'm glad I had. Thank you both so much, Mark, Kathy, you're stars, and we really appreciate your sharing your ideas with us. That's the end of this particular session. Please come back if you can another time, and this will be online, so tell your friends about it. Thank you so much.